Okay, so today we'll be discussing the ins and outs of a working paper. You can call this working paper 101. We'll go through the essentials, the details, and everything in between when it comes for you to draft a working paper, right? So to start, a working paper is basically the summary of a debate that the days may ask you to present at any given point inside of the committee, right? It works differently everywhere. For where we are based in Pakistan, it is extremely different to how it may be at, for example, at Harvard or maybe at Oxford, right? So, a summary of debate in the sense that you provide the committee a summary of what you believe you've discussed, the moderated caucuses, certain arguments that may take in an unmoderated caucuses, your general speakers list, your yields, everything that comes in between, right? So, how do we make one? We'll get into that very shortly. But for the basics, you need to understand that no individual delegate is going to make a working paper on its own unless they're sitting in a one-man block. So how you usually make working papers is in the form of blocks. So for example, we have a block that consists of 15 members and then we have another block that consists of 20 members. Both of these can choose to make a joint working paper, but what a better practice is and what the preference of the delegates in general is that they provide working paper separately towards the chairs, right? So it's made in blocks. The purpose of making it in blocks is that the entire committee, the blocks that are part of the committee, they provide it from their own perspective, their own state policies, and the policies of what the block stands for. For example, what action the block wants to take, or what the block believes in, if it believes in intervention, if it believes in a non-interventionist policy. So that difference of opinion is to be stated in your working papers as well. Now, there's one thing about working papers is that out of all of the 3 to 4 documentation pieces that are a part of UN committees, this is the easiest one to make because it has no set format. There are a few things that you need to keep in mind, but apart from that, there is not a lot that you need to go through. I'll show you 2 examples. One which is done according to the formation of a resolution, and another one that anyone can make basically. So the next thing that you need to keep in mind is that it has to have a set number of signatories. Meaning that if your working paper fails to come up with, let's say, 7 signatories, the working paper cannot be entertained by the days because it does not grasp the attention of a certain number of members in the committee. Right? For example, for General Assembly committees, it is usually either 1/6 of the committee or 1/8 of the committee. So let's say that your committee has 48 delegates. So a 1/6 majority would be 8 delegates and a 1/8 would be 6 delegates. So you would either have 6 or 8 delegates depending on what the chair wants. If these 6 to 8 delegates are a part of your signatories, only then will your working paper be introduced. A minimum of 6 or 8, right? You can have 15, 20, you can have even 45, 46, 47 delegates for that matter. So it is usually presented towards the end of day two. This is the typical time for ADIS to ask you for it, a working paper. Usually in the last session as well. For Pakistan, it's usually 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. when we do ask for working papers. So we'll move towards formats now. I did draft 2 separate working papers. I will show you the differences in both, and then I shall compare which one fits better with the days. Okay, before we proceed, further, I'd like to point out that all of these working papers and any sort of documentation or any video in general that we make will be following the HarvardMUN guidelines, and everything that we make will be in accordance to the HarvardMUN guidelines. So when you start off a working paper, you can clearly see here that the entire document is presented in the form of Times New Roman. This is one of the criteria that you do have if you want to present a documentation, be it a working paper, a position paper, or a resolution, right? So a working paper starts with obviously the heading. You're supposed to keep it in either a 12 or a 13 font, and you're supposed to bolden this heading, right? So the numbering of a working paper entirely depends on what the days provides with or the general consensus of the committee. For example, if one block agrees that this block can be working paper 1.1, then yes, fine, you can be working paper 1.1. but generally depends on the allocations that the day provides you with. Right, you've given the heading. Next, these four things are the only major things that are required for you to create a working paper. You include the committee. For this, we have the UN Human Rights Council. Then you have the topic, which we have chosen to be the ethnic violence against minorities. Next, you have a sponsor, and then you have a signatory. Right. So the sponsors are the people that are ideally responsible for presenting the working paper towards the committee. And sometimes, depending on what conference you go to, these are also the people that are in charge of funding the working papers or any mechanism that is presented in the working paper. So, according to HarvardMUN, we will not be following the funding criteria. For this, the sponsors are the people that are basically your block leaders and those that will present to the committee. Right? A signatory is anyone that can basically debate on your working paper. It can be somebody that is a part of your block, and it can be somebody that is not a part of your block. For example, we've assumed that Austria is not a part of our bloc, but we've still included them as a signatory because they want to debate on the matter. They want to debate on our working paper. They want to point out the intricacies, the flaws, etc. Anything that is a part of our working paper, right? So, a working paper is basically the summary of debate, as mentioned before. So, for this summary, we've chosen six main different clauses that we'll be going through. So the first one is talking about a landmark resolution. We'll read it as now. Recalling the principles set forth in Resolution 47-135, the Landmark Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National, Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities as a primary framework for state responsibility. So we've talked about a existing landmark or resolution that primarily has shown light on the topic before, right? So this is something I will assume that I've discussed in the committee. I've discussed resolution 47-135, right? Next, deeply concerned by the persistent rise of systematic discrimination and violence targeting ethnic and religious minorities across multiple regions, which poses a direct threat to international peace and security. Okay, so we've discussed a very general topic, which is the systematic discrimination and physical violence of ethnic and religious minorities. But a lot of examples can be seen across the world in your in your communities as well. So that is something that I believe we've discussed. Noting with regret the lack of standardized early warning systems capable of identifying pre-escalation patterns before localized skirmishes evolve into full-scale humanitarian crises. Okay, again, this is something that is related to certain states where, for example, there's a very high crime rate against ethnic minorities. So the points out the clause rather points out the flaw in their early warning systems, right? Next, expressing its appreciation for the ongoing work of the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues and the OHCHR in documenting human rights violations despite significant access constraints in conflict zones. Okay, so this clause has basically talked about how the Special Rapporteurs on Minority Issues and the OHCHR as well as other UN bodies have been able to provide us reports despite there being a lot of barriers that all rapporteurs and journalists have to go through to convey the message. Right? Next, emphasizing that the exclusion of minority groups from political representation and the local law enforcement often leads to a breakdown in social cohesion and a lack of and a loss of public trust in state institutions. Okay. So this one talks about how the minorities have little to no access in the political standpoint of the state affairs, meaning that they themselves cannot make the law which is present for them. Okay. Next we have the last clause, which is confident of the policy put forth by inclusive member states on resolving the issue through multilateral means and establishing several accountability measures in areas including but not limited to Southeast Asia and the Arabian Peninsula. So I put this one by purpose, on purpose rather. This clause basically talks about the bloc's policy, which is multilateral cooperation and establishing several and severe accountability measures throughout areas which are affected. Right? So I'll tell you the main things of what makes this working paper an acceptable one. The standard basically for presenting working papers after we've discussed working paper 1.2. Okay, we'll now move on to working paper 1.2. We've kept the general format same, except that we changed the numbering here. So the committee topic, the sponsors and signatories remain the same. I've just changed the layout and how this working paper functions basically. Okay. So the summary of the committee affairs are as follows. I'll just scroll through this. You can pause if you want to read. The clauses are basically the same. It's just that I've changed how the format works. Okay. So the difference here is that this does not technically follow the HarvardMUN guidelines on how to make a perfect resolution, considering that this is not a resolution. So we've opted for a bullet points format. We've chosen bullet one and then sub bullets, etc., etc. Right? We've included full stops, bolding, and everything that you can see that is not relevant to how the other working paper went. So the difference here is that it does not give the days a very formal image of you as a block. However, for this working paper, you can see that this is made in accordance to the HarvardMUN guidelines, right? So you have a preambulatory clause, which is a clause that you use to define a problem, right? The list of preambulatory clauses can be found in the HarvardMUN guidelines. I'll try to share a link in the description of this video, as well as several key terms that may be important or may be confusing towards newer delegates, right? So this is made in accordance to the HarvardMUN guidelines. This one is much better. Why? Because when you transition towards a draft resolution, it becomes extremely easy for you to transition into a draft resolution. I'll show you what I mean. Okay. So this is a sample working paper. You can go through this as well. This is something that is presented to us by the HarvardMUN team. So this is a brief working paper. They're usually 2.5 pages. Okay. So here is what I'm talking about, the draft resolution. So you'll see that this draft resolution and our working paper have a few things in common. Firstly, the heading. This is just given to show that this is a sample resolution. The committee, the topic, the sponsor, the signatories, everything is the same till now. The difference is that we've included these clauses. These clauses typically are called preambulatory clauses, and these refer to us talking about the problems that we have identified during the committee. So a preambulatory clause is basically a clause that is provided by the Harvard National team as well. I'll show you those as well. Those are basically used to define problems within the status quo. I'll show you an example of preambulatory clauses as well. So these are preambulatory clauses. These are the agreed upon preambulatory clauses that are within the HPN guide, right? So you can use any of these when you're making your own working paper. Even for the working paper that I've made, I've tried to include all preambulatory clauses that were uh, a part of the HarvardMUN guidelines, right? So this is pretty much it from things that you would want to include in your working paper, apart from just one thing that I would like to add is that when you're making a working paper, some delegates like to include their countries' names. That, for example, uh, let's say Pakistan, right? Pakistan mentioned resolution 47-135. This is a very petty practice that a lot of delegates do to show that they are a key stakeholder within the working paper. This gives a negative impression that you want to, let's say, counter die and seek a, for example, I've given 6 clauses and the other one has given 3 clauses, so ultimately I have given a better contribution. The contribution is directly proportionate to whether if you're a signatory sponsor or not, and secondly, your performance within the unmoderated caucuses. Mentioning that the framework presented by delegate of Sudan is better than it does not make any sense, and it is a very petty practice to do, and it is seen negatively across the days. So that is pretty much it from our side regarding working papers. If you do have any questions, please feel free to comment down below. We will certainly look into them once we get the chance.